on
Mr. President, Mr. Secretary General, ladies and gentlemen, it is a great pleasure to join the cordial congratulations extended to Mr. Mogens Lykketoft to honor his election as the President of the 70th session of the United Nations General Assembly. The 70th session of the United Nations General Assembly brings in a unique opportunity to not only comprehend the accomplishments the United Nations has achieved during its 70 years history, but also to reiterate our strong commitment to meet aspirations and expectations of our peoples for secure and sustainable development. It is 70 years the United Nations stands for peace and security, development of international cooperation and human rights. Over this short in terms of history period, the United Nations has done a lot to promote stability, sustainable development, reduce poverty and eliminate inequality all over the world. Over these years, mechanisms of interaction we set up together facilitated international cooperation remarkably. Recently, the United Nations Summit adopted the new 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, which lays down a solid ground and identifies the areas of further efforts of the international community at achieving sustainable development that would meet the interest of all peoples and each individual. Over the 7 decades, the United Nations has made a remarkable contribution to sustaining the processes of formation of new independent states and their further development. At the dawn of its independence, Tajikistan, having faced with the difficulties of transition period, received every kind of support from the United Nations, and this support enabled the country to embark on the road towards democratic development. The major pillars of Tajikistan's development, laid down with the assistance of the United Nations, contributed to the country's involvement in international processes of cooperation and a partnership. Today, Tajikistan is contributing significantly to counter-terrorism and extremism, fighting transnational organized crime, trafficking in narcotics and weapon smuggling, trafficking in human beings, and to the promotion of the United Nations water agenda. Our national police officers are participating in the joint peacekeeping operations of the United Nations and the African Union in Darfur and are contributing to peace-building process shoulder to shoulder with the colleagues from other member states. The Drug Control Agency that was established with the United Nations support continues to play an important role in countering trafficking in narcotics. Since 1995, Tajikistan drug enforcement authorities have seized more than 111 metric tons of narcotics. This amount is equal to 206,650,000 drug doses, and which could have turned 50 million people of our shared planet into drug abusers. This data proves that Tajikistan is ranked among the top 10 states in the world that seize the largest amount of drugs. Mr. President, the world has transformed dramatically over the last decades. The current stage of the global processes are more dynamic and complex. Along the positive aspects of globalization that contribute to overall development, its negative impact that threatens security and development in the entire world and in individual countries has become obvious. The increase in the number of armed conflicts and acts of terror, food, energy and financial and economic crisis, degradation of environment, climate change, spread of infectious and deadly diseases demand a concerted and comprehensive response. In this context, the United Nations remains the key platform for achievement of consensus on the key issues of international security and development, and also for coordination of joint actions of the entire international community in meeting global threats and challenges. We are pretty much concerned of the scope and the spread of the current threats caused by terrorism, drug trafficking and organized crime. Destructive and inhuman forces of terrorism and extremism have been gaining in power, involving in their spectrum the ever-increasing number of young people. These forces seriously undermine the efforts at maintaining security and peaceful development of the countries and regions. Combating international terrorism and extremism has become a top priority. There is an undeniable need in developing national, regional and international mechanisms aimed at elimination of military infrastructure, blocking channels of financial and logistics support, recruiting, preventing propaganda of violence, and counteracting the use of modern information and communication technologies for the purpose of terror. In addition to the above, it is essential that we, through our joint efforts, seek for ways to addressing the issues of poverty reduction, dealing with the negative impact of globalization, likewise preventing and resolving regional conflicts, strengthening cross-cultural and interfaith dialogue, mutual trust and tolerance would play a pivotal role. It is in our common interests that the Member States implement the United Nations Global Counter-Terrorism Strategy and relevant resolutions of the United Nations General Assembly and Security Council effectively resist to any forms and manifestations of terrorism, including the use of Internet for terrorist purposes. Our joint response to a vile outburst of terrorism and extremism should be relevant to the scope of this threat. Prevention of drug trafficking, which has unfortunately been increasing year by year, should become an integral part of our common struggle against terrorism and organized crime worldwide. Money earned from drug trafficking is channeled to financing the acts of terror and organized crime activities. In this context, a special United Nations General Assembly session on drugs to be held in 2016 is going to bring in an opportunity not only to review the implementation of the political declaration and plan of action, but will also help to develop a new and effective measures for combating this evil. In the light of these efforts, Tajikistan this May held a high-level international conference on drug control with the aim to consolidate international cooperation on counter-narcotics. Mr. President, friendly neighboring Afghanistan has embarked on the implementation of the decade of transformation in the country. The new stage of enhancement and reinforcement of security and stability, rehabilitation of economic and social sectors of the country is accompanied by addressing the most urgent and practical issues, which requires an increasing targeted assistance of the international community, where the United Nations should play a central and coordinating role. Tajikistan stands for expanding friendly and good neighborly relations with Afghanistan and calls on the international community to support the efforts of the government of this country at achieving peace and stability by addressing the social and economic challenges the country is facing, continuing the process of national reconciliation and inclusive dialogue, and involving the country in the regional cooperation. Tajikistan continues to make its contribution to the social and economic development of this neighboring country. Peaceful solution of the disputes on Iran nuclear program proved the enormous potential of a diplomatic means to resolve urgent problems of our shared planet. We are convinced the joint plan of action on Iran's nuclear program adopted by the United Nations Security Council resolution will contribute to the strengthening of regional and international peace, genuine stability, and mutual confidence, and will be instrumental in reinforcement of the nuclear non-proliferation regime. We hope that United Nations member states will be guided by goodwill and will sustain firm resolution to untie the knots of the most urgent disputes and conflicts by using political and diplomatic means in addressing other major issues. Tajikistan last July hosted regional consultations for the countries of South and Central Asia on the preparation to the World Humanitarian Summit 2016 in Istanbul. We hope that recommendations voiced at these consultations will have a positive effect on humanitarian activities of all countries. Shortly in December, the international community will meet in Paris again to conclude the round of negotiations on climate change that has begun in Bali. We hope that the member states will take advantage of this opportunity and will adopt a new document on climate change based on the principles of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, and by doing so will lay down a solid ground for a transit to sustainable development. We believe that such a transit requires not only an industrial modernization based on innovative technologies, but also needs significant changes in the mindset and the pattern of consumption of the peoples. The long-term observations of our experts attest to the increased impact of climate change on the environmental, social, and economic situation in the country and region. According to these observations, over the last 60 years, the average annual temperature in Tajikistan increased by 1 degree Celsius. The number of days with heavy precipitation increased. Natural meteorological disasters became more frequent and severe, and the process of glacial degradation accelerated. This summer, as a result of the abnormally high temperature and severe precipitations, the mountainous parts of the country suffered from the natural disasters that caused the economic damage worth of hundreds of millions US dollars. Regrettably, the natural disasters claimed human lives. In terms of CO2 emissions, Tajikistan ranks as 135th in the group of countries with the least greenhouse gases emissions. Per capita greenhouse gas emission in the country is 10 times less than the average world index. A broad use of renewable energy sources, predominantly hydropower, would facilitate economic and social development of the country and help to build up green economy. It is getting obvious that climate change affects the quantity and the quality of freshwater resources. It is known that as a result of climate change, the amount of water resources stored in glaciers and snow caps has diminished, and the area of groundwaters affected by salinization has increased, and precipitation have become more frequent and heavier. In its turn, hydrological cycle changes may have a negative impact on water, energy, and food security, and can entail extra risks of floods and extreme droughts. We believe that under these circumstances, it is essential to review the existing practices of water resources management and in order to ensure adequate adaptation not only to climate change, but also to growth of population and world economy, as well as to freshwater resources scarcity. In Central Asia, where water resources are a key factor in achieving sustainable development of the region, the need for elaboration of a comprehensive regional plan for adaptation to climate change became urgent long ago. This imperative is also driven by an accelerated degradation of glaciers in the region as a result of climate change. Their observations and expertise confirm that since 1960s, the glaciers of the region, which remain the main source of water for the Central Asian rivers, have been degraded by 3 times. Mr. President, 2015 is the final year of the International Decade of Action Water for Life 2005-2015, a global initiative approved by the United Nations General Assembly to facilitate the achievement of Millennium Development Goals. With the purpose of reviewing the progress and analyzing gaps during the implementation of the International Decade, a number of water forums have been held, such as United Nations General Assembly high-level interactive dialogue on a comprehensive review of the progress during the implementation of International Decade for Action Water for Life, held last March here in New York, and a high-level international conference on the implementation of the International Water Decade held in Dushanbe, Tajikistan, this June. We expect that during summing up the results of the decade, the United Nations will take on board the outcomes of these events and other forums of the decade that were held in support of a comprehensive review of the implementation of the decade. I'd like to avail myself of this opportunity to extend my deep appreciation to the Member States, the President of the United Nations General Assembly, United Nations Secretary General, to the United Nations agencies and institutions, international organizations, representatives of civil society, academia and business for their active participation in the implementation of the decade in summing up its results. We have a few days ago adopted a roadmap for achieving sustainable development which incorporates the water component comprehensively. In the next 15 years, against the background of ever-increasing impact on water resources of climate change, degradation of environment, population growth, food and energy crisis, we will have to undertake enormous efforts for a timely achievement of the goals we have set forth. And in our view, development of cooperation, partnership and water diplomacy will promote a timely adoption of relevant measures to mitigate the impacts of destructive processes and help to timely achieve sustainable development goals. In this context, there is a need for new and additional platforms on strengthening and expanding cooperation at all levels with engagement of all interested stakeholders. In this regard, and given the positive outcomes of the previous joint initiatives, we propose to consider the possibility of proclaiming a new international water decade aiming at promoting the implementation of the new agenda for sustainable development. We sincerely hope that all United Nations member states will deliver their support to make this initiative a reality. I thank you very much for your attention.
On behalf of the General Assembly, I wish to thank the President of the Republic of Tajikistan for the statement just made. May I request representatives to remain seated while we greet the President.